Good afternoon, class. I'm really excited to get to share with you an introductory video on critical university studies and then one of my favorite topics in higher education scholarship, neoliberalism, a very complicated word and term that's used a lot. So I'm excited to share with you just some introductory thoughts and introduce you to some readings on the idea. So what is critical university studies? I'm going to move my video a little bit there. So critical university studies, like most critical disciplines, is an interdisciplinary effort to sort of critique or understand the ways in which larger culture and larger social forces shape institutions of higher education, and in turn, how institutions of higher education sort of adopt those thoughts and ideas and norms and then reinforce them back to that culture through students, how students pick up these messages, how institutions socialize their students and faculty and staff by all measures, that sort of reinforce those larger movements. So critical university studies, I think the best way to think about it is like a reciprocal relationship. And it's kind of similar to maybe sort of introductory ideas in psychology or sociology courses, at which how is an individual, like, does the individual shape society or does society shape the individual? Well, in a lot of ways, it's both. And in different contexts, in different circumstances, one of those polar opposites may have more force than the other and may change over time, but it's really a reciprocal relationship when we're thinking about critical university studies and the relationship with institutions of higher educations into the surrounding cultures. And so it's also important to think that it's not necessarily static. So some of the issues that we are going to talk about later, neoliberalism, might not be all of the issues that institutions of higher education under critical university studies are going to be faced with at different generations, at different time periods. It could be particular like racial or cultural demographic change issues that institutions shape and things of that nature. So, and it's just important to understand that this reciprocal relationship is, again, it's not, institutions are not completely formed by their cultures. They're also not completely separate from their cultures in the same way that all cultures are going to have centers of intellectual and sort of like spiritual, I mean that in a very broad sense, like social animating forces. And in American and Western cultures, higher education is definitely one of several institutions that are part of that. And so within critical university studies, again, a very interdisciplinary, I'm really going to focus on one of the most common themes today, which is more economic. And that is where special attention within critical university studies are really paid to, like, the move towards privatization within higher education, particularly in the last 40 years since, what many political theorists call the Reagan Revolution and Ronald Reagan's administration in the 1980s, and a sort of cultural backlash to sort of the liberalism of the 1960s and 70s. And so that move towards privatization and what that means. And so neoliberalism is a word that you hear a lot, or perhaps you don't hear as much as my classmates and my cohort have heard from the last 3 or 4 years. But neoliberalism is a really complicated word. There's not going to be one clear definition, and different theorists are going to talk about it in different ways. And I'm actually going to share with you, this is my definition that I've created for my dissertation that I'm drawing on several sources here. But it's an ideological commitment to the free market, laissez-faire economic principles that claim the superiority of capitalist social structures to create fairness and opportunity throughout social life. So there's a lot there. We'll break that down a little bit. So an ideological commitment, and this kind of goes down into some of those sub bullet points. When I speak of neoliberalism, and when a lot of people talk about neoliberalism, they're not inherently talking about capitalism. They're not inherently saying whether capitalism is good or bad. That's a sort of a conversation almost different from this, because what we're talking about is a narrative. We're talking about a story. What Marx uses the phrase superstructure. Pierre Bourdieu called neoliberalism the dominant discourse, the discourse of all discourses. all social societies and all social groups have these sort of animating stories, myths. I use myths here again very broadly because some people are going to hear the word myth and think that those things are false. Myths can be true, but basically an animating story or force that we tell ourselves, and that we often don't realize how we tell the stories. This is what Marx calls a superstructure. Is it's so embedded within our hearts, within our minds, within our language, within our institutions, that we all do this at an unconscious level. And we all do this at an unconscious level, even if it reinforces a social structure that does not benefit ourselves. Essentially, it's how we sort of embody oppression, and how we, in all groups through all times, like how they can come to believe the dominant discourses of the society, even in a society that's creating racial, economic stagnation and stratification. So I want to focus there, ideological commitment. So when I say free market or laissez-faire economic principles, it's the idea that markets are inherently forces that create flourishing within social order, and that interfering with markets in any sort of way is essentially going to interfere with opportunity and freedom. And that these forces are what can liberate people, liberate hearts and minds, and bring about the greatest amount of social flourishing. So neoliberalism is a very, very broad theoretical idea. It extends beyond higher education. But like all social and animating forces, it in turn has an influence in higher education. So going a little more specific, what does neoliberalism in higher education mean? And I really like what William says. Neoliberalism turns higher education into capitalist prep institutions. And so what does he mean by that? A capitalist prep institutions. It means that degree pathways or credentials only become valuable if they have specific quantifiable market value. Said more simply, only if it leads to particular types of careers, particular types of salaries, particular types of social opportunity. Higher education becomes only a means of social mobility and economic returns. It does not become an institution that has value because it creates democratic engagement within its citizenry, or that it improves the social lives of people just becoming by being exposed to new ideas and new thoughts. But rather, it only becomes valuable when it has quantifiable market value. And then students, in turn, they seek out those pathways, those credentials that are going to lead them into the managerial class, and they seek higher education to do that. And so higher education becomes sort of the gate to particular levels of society. And so again, you start to see this reciprocal relationship under that critical university studies broader frame of institutions are socialized to believe and to sort of inhibit these behaviors, to reinforce to students that this is what you should do. And then therefore families and students in larger society, they seek higher education to that end. And it becomes this reciprocal relationship where both the institution and the students are reinforcing these narratives and beliefs to each other. Under the capital plus model, or neoliberalism, as neoliberalism in higher education, students are constantly seen as consumers, and consumers that have consumer demands that IHEs need to meet. Sort of like any commodity, any company that wants to meet consumer demand is going to be successful in the market, and thus IHEs need to reform or innovate and have an entrepreneurial spirit to meet these particular type of consumer demands. And again, students in demand believe that they are consumers, and they approach the institution as a means to fulfill their consumer-based desires. And again, you see that reciprocal relationship. Students are socialized to think this is what IHE is supposed to do, and thus IHEs do what students come to them demanding that they do, and on we go. So broadly, this is kind of what neoliberalism does to higher education. It makes it a capitalist prep institution. So what's some of the evidence to this? What are some of the ramifications that we see from this within higher education, how it relates to other sort of movements of neoliberalism within the culture? You see public divestment from higher education. So many of you know that over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen a decrease in state subsidy or state appropriations to higher education. And then you've also seen the rise of performance-based funding. So whatever appropriations are left, more and more of it is going based on performance and performance-based. And you can see how that easily fits within neoliberal ideology. Only those institutions that are meeting particular types of outcomes should be rewarded, which is one of the central tenets of market capitalism. And so decreases in state subsidy, increases in performance-based funding, that has left institutions with a greater need to solicit private donations and to solicit private capital in the form of donations. What that does to institutions, though, is put specific pressures on catering to the demands of those donors. If you make a large gift to the institution, if you believe, as part of a neoliberal ideology would enforce on you, that your capital sort of demands certain returns, you then can give that money to the institution and expect particular types of things. That inherently isn't always bad, but when you have conflicting ideologies coming from different monies, institutions are torn in different directions, and then you get things where, like the Koch brothers, who've given large sums of money to institutions, particularly in Florida, to create sort of academic departments that study these very issues and study them from a slanted perspective in talking about their utility and their validity in American public life. So when you have decreased state appropriations and you're going to have to raise your tuition. And so increased tuition is increased student loan debts for students and their families to seek higher education. Well, this isn't a problem under neoliberal ideology because, like any market pursuit, that's an individual's choice. It's an individual's responsibility to finance their own market pursuits. And so higher education becomes one of just several commodities that a student or a family could pursue. And so the idea that higher education doesn't have social benefit or what economists call market externalities, those considerations really aren't important. It's the student's individual pursuit. It's not the responsibility of the state to support the student in that pursuit. And so the student is going to have to take on student loan debt, increased tuition. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but that has larger economic considerations that fit into this way in which all of us start to just see capital continue to flow to smaller groups of people. But you see a reduction in the number of tenured faculty at institutions. And what a reduction in tenured faculty is going to allow institutions to implement more corporate governance structures within IHE. And so you get less faculty buy-in. Faculty have traditionally, and then staff by later extension, but historically faculty have been a huge voice in how institutions of higher education are governed, how they teach their disciplines, and academic freedom to research their disciplines in a way without retaliation from the institution or larger social forces. You see that eroding. And you see that that's a good thing because corporate structures, again, market economies create corporate structures, and these corporate structures can be more lean, they can be more efficient, and they can make higher education operate like a private organization or private entity. But despite all of the lack of, or the reduction in state support and increases to students and families, you've seen a steep rise in executive compensation at higher education. So I was able to be in class with a lot of you last summer. If you remember from week 5, when we read the Pusser et al. Argument or article that spoke on this issue about executive compensation, how presidents' salaries and other executives within the institutions, their salaries are rising at percentage levels higher than the rest of the institution and the rest of different classifications of labor at different income levels. And you also can, frankly, we can use some recent anecdotal evidence made prevalent by the Athens News, which I mentioned to Dr. Harrison this week. They seem to have a really great investigative journalism department. But OU recently gave a huge bonus to an executive, member of the executive team. Another bonus was paid out last summer. That despite the fact that there have been massive layoffs, at the institution and massive reductions in staff um, and budget shortfalls, you see executive team members receiving large amounts of compensation. This is part of a larger trend in the American economy. And since basically the late 1970s, but really since the 1980s on, you've seen what Thomas Piketty calls the emergence of the super manager class. And it's been a massive redistribution of income and wealth that is going to the top 1 to 10% of earners in America. So the top 1 to 10% of earners in America overall are making a higher percentage of income relative to productivity gains, relative to the other 90% of earners within society. And so as this continues to happen, it's sort of is accepted by a lot of us because of sort of a neoliberal narrative at which we all tell ourselves that, well, the market wouldn't reward people this way unless they were bringing some sort of critical skill, critical insight to that organization, and thus creating that organization to flourish. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. That's just simply not true. And it's not true just even from like a social justice perspective. It's really not even true from like an economic perspective. When economists study compensation from the idea of marginal productivity, these super manager classes, the idea that they're bringing some sort of special skill deserving of this high level compensation to the organization, it's not true. And it's definitely not always true. Just something to be considerate of. There's within higher education, there's less value and support for traditional liberal arts disciplines because these liberal arts disciplines, like myself, I was an undergraduate philosophy major, they don't have specific market pathways. There's not a specific pathway for a philosophy major, the way there is even for like a teacher. There's a specific market pathway for somebody who gets an education degree. Even if we as a larger society don't value public education and continue to divest from it, there's still that market pathway, and thus it's justified within a neoliberal ideology. It makes sense. You do an education major, you become a teacher. You do a business finance major, you go get a business finance degree. And so majors that don't have these clear market pathways are not as valued, despite the fact that these disciplines are critical for all the other disciplines in thinking, in providing quality critical thinking skills, reading and writing, exposure to different cultures, disciplines, which is important in the business world, the medical world, and all sorts of other market-oriented majors. And it's also, despite the fact that these disciplines are the historical way that humans have created meaning in their lives and shared a value and purpose within the larger society. And again, you see it, the socialized relationship that students are socialized as consumers, as neoliberals. And so institutions that adopt this capital prep model, when it becomes so embedded in the way that we organize our efforts, in the way that we hire faculty and staff, in the way that we seek our own compensations, we create these institutions that students enter. And this is so embedded within all of the pedagogy, within all that we do, that they don't get the critical thinking skills to be able to even ask themselves, like, is this the world that we even want to live in? Because any socially constructed world ultimately comes down to choices. Like, we make choices individually and collectively as a society for the world to be the way that it is. And we could change them if we made different choices. Well, that requires a certain level of prophetic imagination, if you will. And students are getting less of that prophetic imagination as institutions become more neoliberal, as we just adopt these stories, these myths, these narratives, and we operate from them at an unconscious level. Students don't even realize how much they are being habituated to it, and then are going to perpetuate that on. So I hope you all enjoyed this short introduction. These are just a few references, a couple of the books that and articles. A couple will be posted for you to read for this week, but a couple of other things if you want to check those out as well, if you're interested in this topic. And if you do have more questions about the topic, please send me an email or ask me in one of the discussions or the chats. I'm always happy to talk about these issues, even to the everlasting chagrin of my fellow cohort members who typically have like to play drinking games with how often I will say neoliberalism within a particular class. So talk to everyone later.